What was your reaction to the initial news of another jet crash, which appeared to be fatal, just 48 hours after that fatal collision in D.C.?
Well, it's certainly unusual, but the two accidents are not linked in any way that I know of. It was an unfortunate situation that we had two of them that close.
The one concern I really have is why the Black Hawk crew was not at 200 feet or lower.
They should not have been that high. That, in my opinion, unless there was a mechanical issue, that would be pilot error.
Why was this particular crew, the Black Hawk crew, above that 200 feet? They were actually closer to 400 feet, which put them right at the same altitude, the maneuvering altitude of the regional jet.
Please remain seated until further instructions by the captain.
It comes as video shows the terrifying moments on board a United Airlines flight from Houston to New York City.
New at 10 video taken by a passenger inside a United Airlines jet shows smoke and flames that appear to come from an engine. That plane set to take off from Houston for New York City.
Precaution right now, request fire truck.
United Airlines says that during takeoff, United Flight 1382 received an indication about one engine and halted the takeoff.
Which engine was it? There's engine 2 is our indication, it's right engine.
More than 100 passengers and 5 crew members were on board, United Airlines says, including Daria Amai Shelton.
You know, we had a big popping sound that was loud enough to startle me out of my sleep, and then the plane actually jolted to a stop.
The flight stopping moments before takeoff, one of the engines shooting flames.
People were screaming. There were people jumping over the seats trying to get off the plane.
More than 100 people on board safely evacuating, some going down an emergency slide.
I thought I was gonna die, so I'm just happy. Once they said, you know, everyone evacuate the plane, and once I was outside, I was just hoping the jet wouldn't blow up in my face.
Given the recent tragedies in the sky, some passengers admit it wasn't easy boarding another plane.
I was the last person to get on the plane. I was scared.
And look, I know all of these incidents are very, very scary, but experts insist that flying is still the safest mode of transportation. But without a doubt, Robin, it's got to be safer.
Yeah, as you can understand, there is a lot of concern out there.
We begin, though, here at 10 o'clock with breaking news at O'Hare Airport. About 3 hours ago, a plane hit a vehicle on the tarmac known as a tug. The driver of the tug was pinned beneath it. It had to be rescued. Police say the 64-year-old is now in critical condition with injuries to the head and lower body. No one on the plane was hurt. We're working to gather more information.
A 64-year-old is in the hospital with some critical injuries after operating a tug which collided with an aircraft on the runway while passengers were on board. Now, we know those tugs are those aircraft towing vehicles that work all along the runway, and in this case, it was operated by United and one of its employees. Chicago police say the plane was taxiing after landing as the wing of the aircraft hit the tug while the driver attempted to cross the runway. Police say that's when the vehicle flipped over and pinned the 64-year-old man underneath. He was taken to Luther General Hospital with some head and lower body injuries. Police say the man has been stabilized, though. American Airlines confirms this was one of their aircraft.
Planes and helicopters flying just a few hundred feet from each other. This past week's string of aviation incidents, top of mind for flyers, and an American pilot trying to reassure his passengers.
I had no higher calling than carefully and professionally transporting you today.
We are back from Washington tonight, from the banks of the Potomac River, the site of that horrific crash, the deadliest plane crash in more than 2 decades in the U.S. And we have more tonight on the breaking news in on that case. We want to go to the images moments ago.
And data, at least so far from the time of impact, seems to show that that helicopter was flying too high. What is your takeaway right now, Keith, from the limited details we are learning right now?
Well, we've got a few pieces of evidence that are important. As you say, the helicopter was flying too high. The helicopter was flying a route which has what we call a hard deck. The helicopter could not climb over 200 feet and maintain his air traffic control separation. The collision took place at 325 feet. So obviously both the airplane and the helicopter were at that altitude when it took place. We also have information that the helicopter was off course somewhat, and the radio communications are in question as well. The helicopter should have been on one frequency and they operated by a single controller, and the airplane on another. That did not happen. Apparently the tower was understaffed that night, and one person had been allowed to go home early. Consequently, we had a single person controlling airplanes and helicopters on the same frequency, which is not the way it's supposed to work there at that time.
In another major move tonight, the FAA now suspending helicopter routes over the Potomac River in the area over and around the airport for at least 30 days. An FAA document and flight radar show that the Army helicopter may have deviated outside of its approved route at least once in the seconds before the crash. And early data shows it was flying above 300 feet when it should have been under 200. The NTSB tonight revealing they have recovered the helicopter's data and voice recorder, as well as both of the plane's black boxes, including the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. They say river water got inside. Investigators recreating the final minutes leading up to that mid-air crash before that American Airlines flight started its descent. At 8:43 p.m., the jet's pilots told to land on a shorter runway. That Black Hawk helicopter now also making its way up the Potomac River. At 8:45 p.m., air traffic control alerting the helicopter to that jet's approach. At 8:47 p.m., asking the Black Hawk pilots to again confirm they see the jet. You can hear the alarm go off as they ask the Black Hawk, "Do you see that jet?"
S25, CRJ in flight. S25, F1 is CRJ. This club has an aircraft inside separation.
Seconds later, the collision.
32017.
That final communication, a crucial piece of the investigation.
I had no higher calling than carefully and professionally transporting you today. So with that, relax and enjoy the beautiful evening that we get to fly in. We'll be underway shortly. Welcome aboard.
It's really touching because the pilot's speaking to the concerns that he knows that those people probably have sitting on that plane. By the way, that was American Airlines flight 1044, which was headed for Miami on Thursday, just a day after the American Airlines plane collided with that helicopter in DC. I think we just listed off several instances of planes and mishaps. It still goes back to it is by far the safest mode of travel there is statistically. And it had been 16 years since there had been a plane crash, domestic plane crash with a carrier here in the U.S.
I want to give some perspective here. I've covered many instances and stories of plane crashes. Small plane crashes, these are things that happen actually pretty often. Typically, we don't hear about what we've seen recently, which is large numbers of people passing away in these crashes. But whether it be small plane crashes or, our larger commercial flights, there are so many efforts underway to make sure that those flights stay safe, to make sure, to Ben's point, that it remains one of the safest forms of transportation because you are being carried through the air with an expectation of making it to your home safely. So I'm sure those efforts are going to be continuing to just continue to move that needle and make sure everyone stays safe on that very critical mode of transportation.
Early data from the deadly DC plane crash last week is now showing conflicting readings on the altitudes of the American Airlines plane and that Army Black Hawk that it crashed into. Now, the plane's data recorder showed that it was about 325 feet in the air, but control tower data showed that the Black Hawk was at 200 feet. Obviously, that's not right, or they wouldn't have collided. So we haven't gotten any explanation yet for that, but investigators say they're still working to get data from the helicopter's black box.
Breaking just moments ago, President Trump agreeing to pause the anticipated tariffs against Mexico for 1 month, hours before they were set to go into effect. Mexico agreed to send 10,000 troops to the border as part of the agreement, which averts a trade war with our southern neighbors for now. And Trump's next call today is to Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Not even 2 weeks in office, President Trump already scoring another victory for the U.S., this one against ISIS. He ordered a military airstrike against the terrorist group's leaders in Somalia.
All right, for more on both plane crashes, let's bring in former pilot and aviation attorney Arthur Rosenberg. Arthur, thank you for taking time. We appreciate your insight, and let's just get your initial reaction. We've all seen the horrific crash in Philadelphia around 6:30 last night. What do you make of what may have happened? I learned from covering the Washington crash as a reporter in going to the NTSB briefings, they say that in all investigations, they kind of look at three things: the human element, the machine element, and the environment element. We think that it was a cold but not particularly harsh environment night. We now just heard in Nate Foy's report from the jet company that there was nothing wrong with the plane. So could this be human error?
Yeah, so the NTSB looks at man-machine weather. I think the most dispositive piece of information we have now are the film that was captured. What I saw in that film, and I kind of juxtaposed that with the radar data, which is available now. So what do we know? We know the plane was climbing out, was in the air about 40 seconds, had reached about 200 knots and about 1,600 feet. When you pick up the film that we have of the crash sequence, it looked like all forward movement of this Learjet 55 stopped. It was preceded momentarily by what I saw was a big flash, probably an explosion. The plane nosed over almost vertically and then went on down within seconds and hit in North Philadelphia. So it devolves down to this: what could cause an in-air explosion like the one that was captured on the film? One of two things or both. One, this was an air ambulance. There were oxygen tanks on board. We don't know specifically what the oxygen tanks were, although some were captured on the ground. They look like simply compressed air, which can be incredibly flammable if those tanks are punctured in flight. And number two, jet fuel. Now, the back of this Lear 55, near the engines, there are fuel bladders. If the engine had a failure through a compressor blade, a turbine blade, and punctured those bladders, it could cause a massive explosion. So either way you slice that, I saw in-flight explosion. Seems the most likely cause, based upon available information now, would be the oxygen tanks or a fuel tank perforation and the tragedy that followed.
You know, Arthur, you're touching on something that Chris Bauer, aviation expert in our last hour, touched on, and that is this rapid descent that we saw. Here's a little bit of what he said. I want to see if you agree.
It looked to me like it was initially accelerating normally, but then it stopped. It seemed to have leveled off, and then it started a descent. Ultimately wound up descending at over 11,000 feet a minute.
Do you agree with that? And would an explosion account for a rapid descent like that?
Yeah, so what he said objectively, I completely agree with. What I'm kind of like drilling down with is what could cause that based upon available information. And for me, there's only two things. Massive explosion, either caused by an oxygen explosion, probably a tank on board, oxygen tank, or perforation of a fuel bladder in or near the engines. Once that happens, the engines flame out. There's no forward movement, which accounts for why the forward movement visually in flight, as captured on the film, seems to show the plane basically stopping in midair, followed by the fatal plunge to the ground. So the NTSB is gonna do their full investigation, but I would note for your viewers that this plane is registered to the Mexican authorities. This is not a United States registered airplane.
Right.
Standards and procedures are different in the two countries. As far as the maintenance of this plane, I would say I would be very interested as a plaintiff's lawyer to know what they did to that plane when it was on the ground at North Philly. They refueled it. Was the refueling done right? Was there any maintenance done to the engines? Were the engine cowlings opened up? What was done? We know that there was a massive explosion. Now we have to find out why.
We do. And Arthur, just in the last 20 seconds or so I've got, just your insight on what you think may be of the cause of the crash here in Washington.
Yeah, well, for my money, the bottom line here is you have a Black Hawk helicopter which meandered into the airspace of the American Airlines plane. It was a half a mile outside the corridor it was supposed to be in, and at least 100 feet above the altitude. They clearly didn't see each other. The air traffic controller's job on this, for my money, was terrible. I think he was preoccupied with getting a flight on and off the main runway, runway 1 at Reagan, which is the busiest runway in the United States of America. They normally have two controllers, one handling the military, one handling the civilian. This controller, we don't know who he was or what his prior schedule was, but I think was overlooked. And at an instant of time when his attention was diverted to the civilian aircraft, this tragedy happened.